To avoid surveillance, some people turn to encryption. They code their communications into undecipherable gibberish to hide it from government scrutiny. But they aren't always successful. Consider the case of Ladar Levison. Levison owned a cloud email company named LavaBit that specialized in encrypted transmission services. LavaBit promised its customers that it would provide highly secure email transmissions in a manner that made those communications invulnerable to interception. Sadly, this promise of privacy outran the company's technology architecture. Individual users were able to communicate with other LavaBit subscribers in a highly secure manner, involving the use of asymmetric encryption keys, which is something we'll get to in a minute. However, the metadata associated with their communications, things like the to and from address, for example, were stored on LavaBit's own servers, encrypted locally by LavaBit. In addition, the encryption and decryption of message content took place on the LavaBit servers, rather than at the two endpoints of email sender and recipient. Consequently, as Levison later eventually acknowledged, what LavaBit actually provided was limited protection of email communications on its own servers using its own key. When the government came knocking on LavaBit's door, reportedly searching for connections between the former NSA subcontractor and leaker Ed Snowden and others, federal investigators demanded that Levison turn over the key that would allow it to unlock the data stored on the LavaBit servers. But since LavaBit had constructed its system with only a single key for all of its metadata, turning over that key meant turning over the data for all LavaBit customers, not just Snowden. Levison resisted the government's request, painting himself as a martyr for the broader principle of freedom to communicate without government scrutiny. But the federal district court ordered Levison to produce the SSL key, that is, the secure socket layer key that was used to encrypt and decrypt communications. Levison complied with the court order and appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, where he also lost. Faced with legal defeat on these two fronts, Levison shut down LavaBit. He would not, he said, subject his customers to further potential government scrutiny. He said, "I've not devoted 10 years of my life to building LavaBit, only to become complicit in a plan which I felt would have involved the wholesale violation of my customers' right to privacy. Thus, with no alternative, the decision was obvious. I had to shut down my company." One of LavaBit's competitors, a company called Silent Circle, followed suit, closing its own email services. Levison's story is important. In this lecture, we'll examine how encryption works, explain why it is important, and then dive down into some of the legal and policy issues at the intersection of surveillance and civil liberties. Edward Snowden's unauthorized disclosures of state secrets and the related fallout, like at LavaBit, has brought the encryption issue to the forefront of the surveillance debate. For instance, some American companies came under a great deal of pressure from overseas customers who feared that they were handmaidens to the National Security Agency and the federal government. Foreigners wanted assurances that their data was secure. Anxious to avoid LavaBit's fate, many major providers of mobile phone operating systems, including Apple, Google, and Microsoft, announced that they would offer new products that automatically enabled the encryption function and that they would not keep any encryption keys themselves. Now, the only person who could unlock an encrypted phone would be the owner of the phone. In turn, the U.S. government expressed great concern that anti-terrorism efforts would be compromised. The FBI director himself came out in direct opposition to these plans. Encryption as a defensive mechanism is not, as we will see, a perfect solution. But what it can do is ensure that your information is confidential and can't be read by anyone else without your permission. Modern algorithms can also provide you with a means of confirming that the information you've received has not been tampered with in any way. Advances in cryptographic technology have made it difficult, increasingly, for individuals to crack a code. Code breaking is as old as code making, naturally, but encryption increasingly has advanced beyond decryption to the point where decryption is in some cases almost impossible. This has the positive benefit of enabling legitimate users to protect their lawful secrets. But if the United States government or Syrian activists can encrypt their data, so too can China, or the Russian mob, or a Mexican drug cartel. So this brings us to a series of very tough questions. Should a government be able to require the manufacturers of encryption technology to limit their distribution, to prevent strong cryptography from falling into malevolent hands? Should the state, in effect, be able to require that code makers build in a back door by which authorities can access and decrypt encrypted messages? And under what rules, if any, might these backdoors be accessed? Encryption is one of the oldest forms of human activity. One of the earliest recorded instances is in the Histories by Herodotus, who described how clandestine communications played a part in saving the Greeks from being conquered by Xerxes, the king of Persia. A Greek, witnessing the buildup of the Persian fleet, sent a message to Sparta warning of Xerxes' plans. To keep the message from being intercepted, it was concealed beneath the wax covering of a wood tablet. Forewarned and prepared, the Greeks were able to assemble their navy and to defeat the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. Conceptually, encryption involves three separate components: the plain text, the algorithm, and the key. The plain text is the substance of the message that the sender wants to convey. Of course, this information doesn't really have to be a text at all. It can be the numerical firing code for a nuclear missile, or the chemical formula for Coca-Cola, or quite literally any data in any form that is more valuable to the sender if kept unknown to someone else. The algorithm is a general system of encryption. In other words, it's a general set of rules for transforming a plain text. One example of an algorithm is a cipher, where, let's say, each letter of the plain text might be replaced with another letter. The algorithm here is replace each letter with another. The third and most essential component of an encryption system is the key. That is the specific set of instructions that will be used to apply the algorithm to the particular plain text message. A cipher key, for example, might be replace the original letter with the letter that is 5 letters after it in the English alphabet. Using this simple algorithm and key, the plain text cat, C-A-T, could then be converted to the gibberish HFY, and the results would now be known as the cipher text. The critical feature is that only someone who has the algorithm and the key can decrypt the ciphertext. So even if the ciphertext is physically intercepted, the contents remain confidential. We've been creating ciphertexts for quite a long time. Early mentions of coded writing can be found in the Kama Sutra, which counseled women to record their liaisons in secret writing. Julius Caesar's use of code was so common that the type of algorithm he used, the letters shift system I just mentioned, is sometimes called the Caesar cipher. Let's look further at the Caesar cipher. If we restrict ourselves to shifting letters of the alphabet, there are only 25 possible keys. one for each successive shift of the alphabet before we get back to the start. That's pretty weak protection. All you have to do is try each of the 25 possible keys, and one of them is going to work. But if we loosen the algorithm a bit, and instead of a shift rule, apply a rule that allows any rearrangement of the 26 letters of the English alphabet, then the number of potential keys increases astronomically to well over 400 septillion different possible arrangements. That's a 4 followed by 24 zeros. That makes a brute force effort to discover the key by trying every possible one difficult indeed. But brute force is not the only method of breaking a cipher. In the 9th century, Arab scholars established that a cipher can be broken by something known as frequency analysis. Frequency analysis rests on the knowledge that, for example, in English, the letter E is the most common vowel. Other common letters in regular usage include A, I, N, O, and T. With this knowledge, deciphering ciphertext becomes much easier. It's far more likely than not that the most frequently used cipher letter, whatever it might be, represents one of those common English letters. In fact, in a ciphertext of any reasonable length, there is virtually no chance that, for example, the most common cipher letter would be the one that was used to signify a Q or a Z. That sort of knowledge makes decryption easier, and it reduces the need for a brute force approach. Indeed, it's a fair assessment of the art of cryptography that until the dawn of the computer era, decryption was quite effective. The keys themselves could be stolen, or they could be decrypted using techniques like frequency analysis. Even the most notoriously difficult German Enigma code from World War II, the one used to send orders to German U-boats, yielded to frequency analysis by English cryptographers at Bletchley Park. There things stood for a number of years. Those who wanted to keep secrets were vulnerable. In the late 1970s, however, enterprising cryptographers developed a way to encrypt information using the multiplication of two extremely large prime numbers and certain one-way mathematical functions. Most mathematical functions, like addition or subtraction, work in both directions. You can get the results from the precursors or the precursors from the results, so to speak. In contrast, a one-way function, as its name implies, works only in one direction. You can get a nice omelet from eggs, but you can't get unbroken eggs from an omelet. With one-way functions, someone who wants to receive encrypted messages can publish the result of an extremely large multiplication as a public key. People who want to send this person a message can use the public key to encrypt their message. And since only the creator knows how to break down his exceedingly large number to its original primes, only he can decrypt the message. Today, you can embed this type of encryption into your email system with an inexpensive software program. If the users at both ends of the message use this form of public key encryption, the messages they exchange between themselves become effectively unbreakable by anyone other than the key's creator. Unless, of course, a hacker attacks the creation of the key at its source. The United States prefers not to hack American companies in this way, at least if it can possibly avoid it. The government's preferred solution is that those who manufacture encryption software should build into the system a backdoor decryption key that will allow the government to read any encrypted messages. According to the government, these decryption keys would then be stored or escrowed with a trusted third party, say a judge at a federal court, who would release the key only under specified limited circumstances. Now, needless to say, many privacy advocates oppose the effort, and their opposition has been successful so far. In the 1990s, the FBI sought to require encryption technology manufacturers to incorporate a backdoor that went by the name of Clipper chip. Opposition to Clipper was based in part on civil liberties objections. Many people were concerned that the backdoor would be used for political purposes rather than to combat crime. The opposition was also based on a practical realization that the government itself was a beneficiary of strong encryption to protect its own secrets. A backdoor in encryption programs would not necessarily be available only to the US government, after all. The United States has no monopoly on the development of encryption algorithms. If the US required backdoors in American products, purchasers abroad would also naturally tend to favor non-American products. So the state would primarily have a backdoor only into its own secrets. Until recently, though, the balance still favored the government, because companies would often hold master encryption keys to their customers' data. You can see why they might want to do that. They might, for example, do so as a matter of convenience. If I encrypt my data and then forget or lose my uncrackable encryption key, then the data is lost forever. So I might be very glad indeed if my phone provider, for example, could unlock my phone and let me recover all of my data, saving me from my own foolishness. Since strong encryption is, for most purposes, uncrackable, governments have turned to an alternate method of securing access to encrypted communications. That is, forcing those who do the encryption to provide it with the encryption keys to decrypt the messages directly. As a result, governments are bringing increasing pressure on service providers to turn over their master keys. That's what happened to LavaBit. At this point, I need to draw a distinction between endpoint encryption and intermediate, or service provider encryption. Google, Microsoft, Dropbox, and all the other cloud service providers use forms of intermediate encryption. When, for example, you store data in Dropbox, or you leave your email in your Gmail folder on the web, the service provider encrypts that information. And the encryption techniques they use tend to be quite strong, making them relatively well protected against outside attack. But for long-term storage, the service provider itself retains that encryption key. The combination of your username and password may decrypt the contents you've stored in the cloud, but your cloud provider performs the encryption for you and holds the encryption key. By contrast, if you use a strong encryption program locally on your own hard drive and then upload the encrypted file to the cloud, the fact that your cloud service provider further encrypts the data is good. But with respect to the government's demands, it's irrelevant. Even if Dropbox, let's say, were compelled by a lawful order to give the government its decryption key, all that it would turn over would be your encrypted file, which you would still have encrypted locally, rendering the file Dropbox gave to the government gibberish. So that's the hierarchical architectural issue. Sometimes the user, you, hold the encryption key, and sometimes your service provider does. Who has it makes a world of legal difference. When the encryption key is held by your service provider, it is likely that the government can get access to the passwords. When you hold it, and when only you hold it, it's much harder for the government to get access. And that's why the move towards automatic endpoint encryption by Google and Apple and Microsoft, amongst others, is so significant for privacy and civil liberties. Oren Kerr, a fellow professor of law at George Washington University, has summarized the general rule. Third-party data holders cannot assert a Fifth Amendment protection on behalf of their customers. The Fifth Amendment says that we all have a constitutional right to withhold from the government testimonial evidence that might be used to convict us of crimes. It's sometimes called the privilege against self-incrimination. But as the Supreme Court held in a case called Fisher versus United States, the Fifth Amendment does not prevent compelling information from a suspect's attorney, because compelling the attorney to divulge information does not compel the suspect, me, to do anything. The same, of course, would be true of my password in the hands of my service provider. In other words, when my data is in Dropbox's hands, my rights don't apply, and I can't use those rights to try and prevent Dropbox from giving the government my information. We could, of course, imagine the service provider opposing the subpoena on its own account, as Ladar Levison did. After all, many companies pride themselves on never allowing the government any kind of direct access to their servers. And of course, by challenging the request and by being subject to an order to compel disclosure, the service providers will, at a minimum, demonstrate that they've made the effort. But in the long run, that just won't work. If the government's inquiry is tied to some grand jury inquiry, or it will be difficult to resist a valid subpoena. It's pretty close to black-letter law, that is, a well-established rule not generally open to dispute, that a grand jury can investigate merely on suspicion that the law is being violated, or even just because it wants assurance that it's not. So this is pretty much an absolute. As a necessary consequence of its investigative function, a grand jury investigation is not fully carried out until every available clue has been run down, and as the Supreme Court has said, all witnesses examined in every proper way to find if a crime has been committed. In United States versus R. Enterprises, the Supreme Court went a long way toward ruling out almost any procedural objection by a data holder to a valid investigation. Beginning from the premise that investigative demands are lawful, the court concluded that investigative demands from a grand jury must be complied with, unless there's no reasonable possibility that the category of materials the government seeks will produce information relevant to the general subject of the grand jury's investigation. And so our first conclusion is that service providers like Google and Microsoft may well resist the government's pressure, and they'll be wise to do so for business reasons, but in the end, they will not succeed. That is why LavaBit lost. By contrast, the endpoint user, that's you or me, who holds his own encryption key, has a much stronger argument to withhold that key under the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. The courts have not yet definitively determined whether or not an effort to compel an individual to disclose the decryption key he holds constitutes a violation of his Fifth Amendment privilege. But the trend is in favor of the individual's protection. In general, the answer to the question turns on whether disclosing the decryption key is thought of more like the production of a physical object, like the physical key to a lockbox, which can be compelled under law, or like the production of a person's mental conceptions, such as the memorized combination to a safe, whose disclosure cannot be forced. The contrasting formulations were posited as a useful analogy in a Supreme Court case that goes by the name Doe versus United States. Doe was asked to be required to sign a blank bank consent form that the government was then going to use to get access to his bank account. Doe objected, but he lost. The court said that signing the form was more like the production of a physical object than it was like being asked to testify against yourself. By contrast, in United States versus Hubble, a case arising out of the Whitewater investigation into Bill and Hillary Clinton, the documents produced by Hubble in response to a subpoena were organized and selected through his own mental analysis. And thus, in that case, they were protected from disclosure. Only a few court cases have addressed the encryption question directly, and those that have are in disagreement. For example, in Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Gelfgat, Massachusetts' highest court concluded that a defendant could be compelled to disclose a password upon pain of contempt of court for refusing to do so. By contrast, in a case called In Re Grand Jury Subpoena Ducis Tecum from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, this first federal appellate court decision on the issue determined that compelled decryption was unconstitutional because it was like requiring the individual to give up the mentally memorized combination to his safe. Suffice to say, the final resolution of this question lies in the future. but I think that the trend is in the individual's favor. Let's close the discussion by adding another twist. One recent technological development is the use of finger scan biometrics to unlock a phone. So what about them? Can a phone owner be ordered to put his thumb on the iPhone? Let's take a look at a case from a Virginia state court in the Hampton Roads area. Consistent with the growing trend in the case law we've just discussed, the court held that a defendant could not be compelled to unlock his cell phone by means of entering his password. So far, so good. But the defendant had made what turned out to be a mistake. He'd also enabled an unlocking feature on his phone so that it could be unlocked with a swipe of his finger. And the court went on to hold that the finger swipe was not protected by the Constitution and could be compelled. You see, since at least the mid-1960s, courts have drawn a distinction between the compulsion of physical evidence and the compulsion of testimony or oral statements. Only the latter, they say, is protected by the Fifth Amendment privilege against compelled self-incrimination. The seminal case here is called Schmerber versus California, in which a divided court held that compelled production of a blood sample pursuant to a subpoena was not a violation of a person's privilege against self-incrimination, that the privilege protected only testimony, not physical evidence. Today, of course, that distinction lies at the core of almost all major law enforcement techniques. DNA, blood sample, fingerprints, hair samples, you name it. The entire cornucopia of CSI techniques all rely at bottom on the unprivileged nature of physical evidence taken from a suspect. So much so that today we couldn't imagine it otherwise. Of course, the law could have gone in a completely different direction, but the distinction is now deeply embedded in our practice. And hence, the finger swipe is no different than requiring a suspect to stand in a lineup or a murder suspect to give a blood sample. What makes the state court case from Virginia especially compelling and interesting is that it's one of the starkest examples I know of where the law is at odds with good cyber practice. You see, in the security domain, information security professionals are increasingly skeptical of passwords as inadequate. This is mostly because people use dumb passwords like password or 123456, or because they often lose their encryption keys. Indeed, the situation is so bad that the White House cyber czar has actually spoken of the need to kill passwords. Most security professionals tend to think that some form of biometric identification is much more secure, avoiding problems of key management and spoofing that are common to passwords. That's precisely why Apple and others have added the fingerprint unlock feature to mobile phones and other devices in the first place. And yet, the inadequate password appears to be a better legal safeguard at protecting privacy than the more security robust biometric. That's exactly backwards. But it's likely the right legally doctrinal answer, because the law protects testimony from the mind, not physical evidence from the body. Finally, we need to recognize that the issues raised by the government's push for greater decryption authority reflect policy questions at least as much, if not more, than they do legal ones. Here are just two examples. What would be the security implications of requiring decryption capabilities in new technologies? And how would granting the US government the access it wants affect international perceptions of American conduct? With respect to security implications, building in decryption capabilities would necessarily introduce potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And not by those who would have authorized access, but rather by hackers who might find a way to crack the capabilities of the protection itself. That actually happened to the Greek government when their own backdoor was used by a rival intelligence agency, from Turkey most likely, to get inside their government's communications. With respect to granting greater decryption capabilities to governments, it is difficult, if not impossible, for the US to oppose such efforts in international forums when its own policy favors expansion of interception and decryption capabilities domestically. Yet, U.S. policy also advocates internet freedom, in large part as a way of energizing democracy movements around the world. And that policy is difficult to square with a domestic move toward greater governmental decryption capabilities. After all, what the U.S. government wants might be exactly what China or Russia want as well. Is that really the company we want to keep?